And you have a book coming up soon?
Yeah. So what this book, the parts work book, is really a kind of general introduction of how to
Mm-hmm.
use this model to understand yourself, and some about how it takes part in the healing process. This next book is called Parts Work: A Path of the Heart, Integrating IFS and Spirituality. And that book is basically, in this book, I share how I integrate spirituality into the work itself in a kind of
Mm-hmm.
a stepwise manner. And then I just give cases
Okay.
where I give transcripts from sessions and how the work unfolded and what it really looks like when that happens for individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So basically it's healing stories then that at the same time shows you how that happens. And if you're a therapist, you can
Mm-hmm.
kind of get a sense for, oh, that's how I could do that if I was already a parts work therapist.
Right.
But I'm thinking that it's interesting for anybody interested in how spirituality can come into
Mm-hmm.
the healing process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. And part of your work is also going to Germany, right? You go twice a year to help the.
Right. And I just came back, and it was very interesting because one of the main themes this time was because Germany is so close to Ukraine and they've been without war for 70 years in the European area. Suddenly, all of the memories of war, and a great deal of the people have histories of being refugees, because when the Russians came in from the east, millions of Germans had to flee to the west. And there
Mm-hmm.
was a lot of trauma that happened to people in that
Mm-hmm.
process. Um, and so all of this kind of family history of trauma was activated, and the people who were working with clients were reporting this. They weren't sleeping, they were waking up with nightmares. There was all kinds of things. So I made that the theme of the work this time. And it was interesting because one of the chapters in my book is about a particular woman's um, healing from childhood sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and she just happened to come to this workshop. I hadn't seen her for a number of years. She's a therapist, and she happened to come to this workshop. And it turns out through this topic, she became aware that her mother was severely traumatized. She knew that intellectually, but her mother
Right.
was severely traumatized by the war, and that she had been carrying this war trauma in a 6-year-old child part of herself that had been repressed and was now
Mm-hmm.
coming up through the exercises I was doing that was helping people to focus on the parts that were activated in this war situation. And she does a really beautiful healing of this part.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just today have been communicating with her and finishing up. I said, is this accurate? Is this what you experienced? And
Mm-hmm.
it's a really lovely thing, because it's one of the things about this book is that I'm collaborating with people to tell their story.
Right. Right.
Not my perception of it, it's my perception and their perception and
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
the experience. And when I have transcripts, it's really great, because then this is what was said, but it's also what happened inside them that they were
Mm-hmm.
able to tell.
Right. Right. Oh, this sounds so meaningful.
For me, one of the, I've been, I'm when I work with people, I'm open to whatever spiritual tradition they bring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For me, when a spiritual tradition is offering that which I hope one would offer, it helps us to deal with suffering, as well as finding sources of joy. It needs to have both things.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, and sometimes that can be a real challenge. So one of the stories is in the book is about a work with a psychiatrist from Lebanon who was a boy, 8 years old, during the Lebanese Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And he's Maronite Christian. And at one point, when he was coming home from school, there was a car bomb, and it killed a whole lot of kids that were all around him. And uh, at that point, this was a part that he had kind of repressed. But when the blast went off in the Beirut harbor last year,
Right.
he started having memories of that explosion as a child. And he remembered, he found this 8-year-old part of him was on the roof shouting at Jesus, so angry at Jesus for letting this happen. How could you let this happen? How could you let this happen? And it's those moments in the spiritual journey where something so awful happens, it shakes your faith. And through the parts work, we were able to allow him to be present with that boy and present with his despair and anger and hopelessness. And because the way this parts work works, we are able to separate out from the parts that are reacting really strongly and be present with them from this loving, compassionate, calm place. So he was able to get into that spot, be with the boy, accept his anger.
Right.
Which is a scary thing, because if you're 8 years old and you have belief, you don't want to be angry at God. I mean, that could be dangerous, right?
Yes.
Angry at God, you could end up in
For
hell.
8-year-olds and older.
And older, anybody, anytime. In fact,
that's a
all
scary
through life, when that
experience.
happens, how do we be angry with God?
Yes.
You know? And what happened in the process was, I tear up when I think about it, because it was so moving. I asked him, is Jesus there? So first he was with the boy was on the roof, the boy was angry, he was able to accept, and the boy felt validated. Okay, it's okay if I have this anger. So he was able to know that, and he wasn't going to be condemned. And I said, is Jesus there? And he said, yes, Jesus is there. And he said, and he's crying. And it was like, to me, it was such an illustration of really what Jesus represents, right? Of feeling the suffering of the world. So it was like, I am with you in this suffering, right? And I feel the pain that this was, and it's painful for me as well. You know, he didn't articulate, he just mainly noticed the tears and the crying. And so then all of a sudden it was like he didn't have to be disconnected.
Right, separated, yeah.
Separated, he could still be in contact. At the same time, there was a deep hopelessness that came, right? Because, okay, if Jesus can't do anything about this.
Right, then who can?
Who can? This world is a pretty awful place, and we're stuck in, right? And so the nice thing about parts work then is we could find the hopelessness and let him focus on it in the body and notice this hopelessness. And he saw it as this stone in his belly, right? And even though it was very dark and heavy, there was a slight glow in it. And he said, okay, there's something that needs to happen with this hopelessness. And sometimes in IFS, what you would do is you would work with him releasing the hopelessness or healing the hopelessness. But he felt, no, I need to just leave it there for now, and that something else will happen. And so we left it at that point. I'm doing this on Zoom with him, you know, we have limited time. So, so it turns out that a few days later, he was at communion. And in the communion, all of a sudden, this dark heaviness, hopelessness began to glow and to rise up. And he had like an epiphany of experience of connection to a divine hope. That
very powerful.
Yeah.
And moving.
And what was really important about that was he had actually raised this issue with me. He came to me to talk about this, because after the blast in Beirut, his friends had said, you know, come and help me, help us clean up after that. And he says, I can't go there. And he normally he would be helping, he would be doing that.
Right.
I can't do it. I can't do it.
Triggering.
He was frozen. And after doing this work and after the experience of communion, he was able to go to the families who had lost their sons and brothers in the explosion as firefighters, and deal with their loss and anger from this place of deep peace and calm. And
compassion and love.
Compassion and love.
Wow.
Right? So, yeah. So, that kind of represents to me what this is all about. How do we
touch the suffering?
and notice that there's a place of transformation of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's very beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that I want to share in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important for people to hear that this can happen, that there's a way for this type of
Mm-hmm.
healing
To unfold, yeah, and to bring that hope. Yeah.
That's right. And that even in the darkest places,
Mm-hmm.
that can awaken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, so that's part of, and all of my work isn't just heavy, dark, dealing with trauma. When I do my groups, I do peace dances. I do these circle dances, dances of universal peace. You know that we're doing Shabbat Shalom and Assalamu Alaikum, singing together in circles, and that to me it's very important to be able to touch joy as well.
Mm-hmm.
If we're
Mm-hmm.
going to touch suffering, we have to be able to touch joy.
Mm-hmm.
Know the sources of joy.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing.